So the introduction is fundamentally the starting place for your personal journey that you're reporting to the reader. And so you make an awfully large impression in the introduction. And it's a way in which you are going to set the scene for what is to come. So if that's, for example, a laboratory report, you're setting the scene for the experiment. Or if it is, for example, a research project, it's the same thing. You're setting that scene. Even if you're writing a review of literature, one would expect to have an introduction. In that introduction, you are providing context. And it's context for everything else that is going to follow. So in this brief video, we're going to go through kind of the construction of an introduction. There are then associated other videos about the sections within the introduction that you can actually dip into to help you with actually building the different sections of the introduction. So why do we have an introduction? What's the purpose? And again, it's fundamentally a good question to ask. Well, it's the place where we provide the essential information to the reader. They have got to be able to understand why you have done what you've done. They've got to be able to understand why the experiment was conducted and understand what the rationale was for the work. So you have to set that in context. And the context might be by using literature. And the literature will be used to provide evidence for the question that you're going to ask. It provides evidence for both that question and the context in which the question is being set. So you have to give that essential information. You have to get people to understand why the study was important, why you undertook the study. So the introduction allows us to go from this, as you'll see in a moment, from this broad to narrow approach, leading the reader from this kind of overview into the more experimentally driven based context or contents. So we have to use literature, and we have to use literature that is relevant, and it has to be appropriate in terms of the time period in which that literature is being collected. Now, that is not to say that we don't ever use literature that isn't relevant, that isn't current. That is not the case. But there has to be a context and justification for why we use that literature. It has to fit within the context of the introduction. We also have to provide evidence for, kind of what are the current views on the problem. And that's why I'm suggesting that we have to have literature that is current, and we have to be able to show that, because again, it sets the context for the reader. So what we are trying to do in the end, if you kind of think about it, is your introduction is about the rationale for your work. Why have you done it, and in what context has it been done? And we think about it as a funnel, upside down pyramid, or as a funnel. I think a funnel is a really good explanation, because you can see this funnel here in 3D, and you've got that huge kind of broad base. It's flipped upside down. And that is very much the way your introduction is going to start. So the broadest part is always at the beginning, and that's where you give the general context, the general information about the study. And then we start to drill down. We become more contextual. And so we start to bring in literature. We've got literature at the beginning as well, but we start to bring in more focused literature. In other words, we're trying to focus the reader and focus the argument in a direction whereby we will get to the rationale and the research question that we want to ask. So we can't set that research question. We can't set the aim or the hypotheses. We can't have those in position if we have no context for what's coming. And the only way we get context is if we get kind of the generalizations in terms of the field in which we're sitting in. Then we get into the more specific questions related to it, to the topic, and then we get into that kind of question that we want to ask. Make sure that you're concise in your writing. And again, it's about not being ambiguous in the terminology. So one of the things I always suggest with introductions is don't be over florid in your writing. So don't use flowery language. That's not scientific. Remember that with science, it's about precision. And what you have to avoid is ambiguity in the language that is being used. It cannot be misinterpreted. That's the fundamental thing about science. We cannot afford for it to be misinterpreted. So when you're thinking about the structure, these are the basic areas that we have to cover within our introduction, moving from that broad to narrow theme. We start off with that background information, the broad brush strokes. We then get into a rationale. So the background information sets up the context, which drives us into the rationale for why the study has been conducted. That then brings us into that kind of testable question. And can you see that we're narrowing it down? We started broad, we have had a rationale, we've asked a question. Now we come with our predictions. That's our hypotheses. And then finally, and don't confuse this, we get into our experimental approach. And we just hint at the kind of the approach that we're going to take. Each of these topics that you see here are available to go through in terms of separate little videos to help you then constructing your introduction. But as a basic starting point, that is the way it has to be designed, from broad to narrow. You don't need subheadings, so there shouldn't be subheadings like these here, but it's from the broad to narrow approach.